Good morning. Last Sunday we finished our LICC series on fruitfulness on our front lines. And we're going to spend the next couple of weeks thinking ahead to Easter. In John's Gospel, the story of Jesus being anointed at Bethany, which we're looking at today, occurs 6 days before Passover and immediately before his triumphal entry into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. And I thought it'd be good for us to reflect on this as we journey towards Easter. And as we do so, to ask ourselves, how do we respond to Jesus? How do we respond to Jesus? In the Lectio course I'm leading at the moment, one of the things we're encouraged to do as part of meditating on a passage, which is one of the stages of the Lectio cycle, is to engage with it imaginatively, to enter into the scene described and to picture what we see, hear, taste and smell. Perhaps also to imagine yourself as one of the characters in the story, and maybe even to read it through several times and imagine yourself as a different character each time. When we read a novel or watch a film, for example, we generally don't hesitate to enter imaginatively into the world which we're reading or watching. And yet so often, when we read the Bible, we switch off our imaginations and view it as more of a textbook to learn from than a text to engage with imaginatively. Yet as Pete Greig says, imagination is one of the most powerful faculties God has given us, particularly when it comes to hearing his voice with our hearts as well as with our heads. With the caveat, of course, that afterwards, as we reflect on what we've imagined, we need to test, as with anything we think we hear from God, that it's true to what we know of God and his character. So before we reflect further on this story, I'm going to read it to you again. And as I do so, I'd like to invite you to consider, where are you standing or sitting in this story? And what can you see? Are you one of the characters mentioned, or just a bystander looking on? What background sounds are you hearing? How are you feeling? Are you tasting or smelling anything? And if you really struggle with entering into imaginatively, I know some people find this much easier to do than others. It's not something I find particularly easy myself. Then perhaps just see if any particular words or phrases or actions really stand out to you. As I read the passage to you now, invite the Holy Spirit to prompt you, to nudge you. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Here a dinner was given in Jesus' honour. Martha served, while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him. Then Mary took about half a litre of pure nard, an expensive perfume. She poured it on Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected. Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages. He did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. Leave her alone, Jesus replied. It was intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial. You will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me. Who do you most identify with in this story? Do you naturally like to be quietly serving Jesus in the background like Martha? Do you just enjoy spending time being with Jesus like Lazarus? Do you sit at Jesus' feet and worship him spontaneously with everything you have, regardless of the cost or opinion of others, like Mary? Or are you cautious and sensible, and perhaps just a little bit judgmental, like Judas? Now take a moment to ask yourself, who would you most like to identify with in this story? Who would you most like to identify with? Today we're going to focus on the contrast between Mary's and Judas's responses to Jesus in this story. First, we're going to think about Mary, and then more briefly, Judas. I looked up and I caught Jesus' eyes. Looking into his eyes, I usually felt challenged and loved all at once. But his usual twinkle wasn't there. All of a sudden, he wasn't celebrating either. He had one of those now my soul is troubled kind of looks. No one else seemed to notice. No one else saw this sadness that seemed to be choking him from the inside. He was suffering alone, but surrounded by all the people who should have known him best. People who should have seen that anguish. I honestly don't know what came over me. I remember feeling his grief. I remember thinking that I wanted more than anything for him to be able to enjoy this celebration in honour of the miracle he performed that touched my heart so dearly. Before I even knew what I was doing, I'd rushed to the other room and back with the costly perfume in hand. The disciples stopped eating. My brother looked at me in shocked silence, and I could feel my sister's scowl from the other room. But it didn't matter. It didn't matter. My friend, my brother, my Lord had sorrow, and I wanted to soothe him. I poured out that costly perfume on his feet. I couldn't speak. I didn't have words. But I wanted him to know, to feel in his flesh that he was loved, that we did care for him, that we were grateful, that at least one person recognised his sorrow. I couldn't make it any better. All I could do was love him with everything I had. He was speechless. Everyone was speechless. The perfume pooled on the floor. I took down my hair to wipe it up. I wiped his feet with my hair, and then, for the first time since I got up, I looked up at him once more. It was like we were the only two people in the room, the only two people in the world. He saw my gift of love, my immense desire to ease his pain, and he looked like his heart would burst. Mary's response to Jesus was one of extravagant worship, of overflowing love, of utter and intimate devotion. Her actions were uninhibited, unreserved, and full of passion for Jesus, her Lord, the one whose feet she loved to sit at, the one whose company she loved to be in, and the one who had brought her beloved brother Lazarus back from the dead. Her heart was overflowing with love and gratitude for all that Jesus had done for her. Yet in this act of extravagant worship, Mary is breaking all the rules. It was scandalous for a woman to let down her hair in public, especially in the company of men, let alone to then use it to tenderly wipe a rabbi's feet on which she's poured a pound of extremely expensive perfume. Most of those watching were appalled. But Jesus wasn't. Jesus welcomed her act of worship and recognised it as a prophetic act of anointing before his coming death and burial. So what can we learn from Mary's extravagant act of worship? I think there's several things. First, Mary's worship was focused on Jesus. It was focused on Jesus, as in the story of Mary and Martha told in Luke's Gospel, when Mary was sat at Jesus' feet listening to what he said. Mary is totally focused on him. She is in his presence, and nothing will distract her from that. Nothing else matters to her when she's in his presence. And on this occasion, she responds to his presence with worship. With extravagant worship, you almost get the impression she can't help herself. She's so caught up in his presence and her love for him. How often do we truly focus our worship on Jesus? How often do we get so caught up in his presence that we're compelled to respond to him in worship, worship that's overflowing from deep within us? Second, Mary's worship flowed from a grateful heart. Mary is truly grateful, truly thankful for the way Jesus accepts her and loves her for who she is, and for all he has done for her, and for what he did for her brother Lazarus when he raised him from the dead. Mary's heart is overflowing with gratitude. How often do we allow our hearts to overflow with thankfulness for all that Jesus has done for us, rather than just acknowledging what he's done for us at an intellectual level? How often do we seek that? How often do we allow our hearts to overflow? Third, Mary's worship was full of humility. Mary was kneeling at Jesus' feet, and it was his feet she anointed, his presumably dirty and quite possibly smelly feet. She didn't presume she was worthy to anoint his head as a priest might. And this humility of Mary's action foreshadowed the foot washing that Jesus himself would do for his disciples a few days later, on the last night he was to spend with them. Do we come before Jesus in complete humility, recognising and owning our own brokenness and sinfulness? Do we, like the tax collector in one of Jesus' parables, pray, "God, have mercy on me, a sinner"? Or do we perhaps sometimes, if we're being truly honest, come before Jesus with just a touch of self-righteousness, with the thought like the Pharisee in the same parable, "God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers," or even like the tax collector? Fourth, Mary's worship did not fear the judgment of others. Mary was so focused on Jesus that she was totally unself-conscious. She didn't stop to consider what other people might think, or if she did, she didn't care, because she went ahead and did it anyway. Her love for Jesus was greater than her fear of what others might think. I wonder, do we worry about what others think of us when we worship? Or when we prioritise going to church or spending time with God over other things? And does this worry sometimes lead us to hold back in our worship, in our wholehearted response to Jesus? Because we're worried about what others might think, instead of focusing on him and him alone. And fifth, Mary's worship found expression in a small act of service. Mary simply offered Jesus what she had. It didn't require careful planning or years of preparation. Mary didn't demonstrate any particular skills, giftings or learning beyond that ability to focus on Jesus when in his presence, and to respond to his presence with wholehearted love and worship and adoration. And the impact of Mary's worship was evident to all, whether they approved of it or not, because the fragrance filled the whole house. Question: is the fragrance of our worship evident to all? Can people tell when we spent time in worship? Are our faces radiant like that of Moses when he spent time talking to God face to face? Yet Mary's worship was costly. Mary offered Jesus the most precious thing she had. She didn't count the cost. She held nothing back. Like the poor widow who put her 2 very small copper coins into the temple treasury, which was all she had to live on. Mary also didn't count the cost of the impact such extravagant worship, such intimate devotion would have on how others perceived her, because she was focused on Jesus. Mary didn't worry about these things or count the cost, because she recognised instinctively that worship is all about relationship. Our relationship with Jesus, with God, and our response to him and what he has done for us. Worship isn't about coming to get something from God. It's all about giving something back to him. Tim Hughes, for example, encourages to see worship foundationally as a whole of life response to the God who has poured out his love to us through the cross. And he reminds us that worship is about the mess and fragility of humanity being caught up in the perfection and love of divinity. It's about an encounter, not rules, religion or regulations. Worship overflows and pours out of us when we understand the wonder of who God is. And this is clearly what happened when Mary was led to anoint Jesus' feet in the story we're focusing on today. The question is, What keeps us from such an outpouring of worship? What keeps us from such extravagant worship? Are we too self-conscious? Are we fearful of what others might think? If so, we need to, like Mary, fix our eyes on Jesus and on him alone. Are we fearful of what might happen if we truly respond to God from the depth of our being and open our hearts fully to him? If so, we need to trust that God is good and only wants what's best for us. Do we really grasp just how much Jesus has done for us and believe that he is worthy of our love, worthy of our devotion, or do we think the cost is too great? If so, we need to ask God to open our hearts afresh as we journey through the events of Easter this year and reflect on Jesus' death, his sacrifice for us, and his resurrection. Are we worried that somehow we're not good enough, not worthy to worship him? Worried that he might reject our worship? If so, we need to look again at the story of the prodigal son and see how much the father loved his son and how readily he forgave him and welcomed him home with open arms. What is our seal which needs to be broken to enable us to truly respond to Jesus and worship with our whole hearts, with our whole being? C.S. Lewis once wrote, "The allegorical sense of Mary's great action dawned on me the other day. The precious alabaster box which one must break over the holy feet is one's heart. Easier said than done. And the contents become perfume only when it is broken." We need to ask God to soften our hearts, to receive him afresh, that we might be willing to freely break our hearts over his holy feet, letting go of whatever it is that is holding us back from offering him the whole of our lives, so that the fragrance of our worship can fill the lives of those around us too. Wholehearted, extravagant worship, because Jesus is worth it. I thought about Mary's response to Jesus, and I want us to think briefly about Judas' response. What did he think? What a waste. What an extravagant, exorbitant, unnecessary display of emotion. Why a whole bottle when a few drops would have been more than adequate? Why break the jar when it could easily have been poured? And why the hair? The whole scene was messy, not at all proper or orderly. As Mary caressed the master's feet, the perfume hung pungent in the air, her sobs the only sound breaking the stunned silence. Why doesn't he tell her to stop, Judas thought as he watched the woman's shameful abandon. He turned away from the scene perturbed. He distrusted all forms of sentiment. "Hey, Judas," one of the disciples leaned over and whispered, "how much do you think a pint of pure nard goes for these days?" Pure nard? Judas hadn't recognised the fragrance. Why, it was worse than he'd thought. The world's most expensive perfume. Someone had to say something. In contrast to Mary's beautiful act of extravagant worship, it's easy for us to dismiss Judas's response as tight-fisted, self-serving and greedy, especially given we know that he went on to betray Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. But I suspect many of the other disciples and onlookers would have been similarly critical of Mary's extravagant, scandalous and costly display of love for Jesus. They just weren't quite bold enough to speak out against it in the way Judas did. Her behaviour was culturally shocking after all, and Jesus had indeed frequently encouraged the disciples to look after the poor. Tom Wright challenges us to put aside our natural inclination to distance ourselves from Judas and to consider instead whether we can see just a glimpse of Judas as we look in the mirror. And if we can, we need to turn to Jesus and remind ourselves of the unlimited grace, mercy and love he has for us. And as we dwell on the wonder of this, our hearts will naturally turn again to gratitude, love and praise. It's also important just to note here that Jesus was not saying we should all regularly spend large amounts of money in our worship of him and neglect the poor. This would contradict much of his teaching and much of that found in the Old Testament too. But rather that this was a special occasion, because as he said, you will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me. Jesus knew his death was approaching imminently, and he wouldn't be with them for much longer. Mary would never have such an opportunity to worship and honour Jesus in this way again. She had to take it. She had to seize the moment. How do you respond when you see people worshipping or responding to God in an extravagant way? Does it inspire you to seek to be more extravagant in your own response to God? Does it help you in your own worship? Or does it perhaps make you feel a bit uncomfortable? Do you wish people wouldn't raise their hand when worshipping in church, for example, or give up their time or money in service of others in response to God's love for them? One commentator has helpfully observed, if we find ourselves becoming very critical of other people, we should stop examining them and start examining ourselves. And that's what we're going to do now, as we come to an end. That's what we're going to do now. We're going to examine ourselves. I'd like to finish by taking you through an exercise included in Pete Gregg's book, The Vision and the Vow. The aim of this exercise is not to discourage us, but rather to help us, as I challenged us at the start, to reflect on how we respond to Jesus. Not how we would like to respond to him, but how we often actually do respond to him. And as I read this next bit, I urge each of us to come before Christ now in honesty, with all our defences down, knowing that he loves and accepts us just as we are. I invite you to imagine that you're looking into the face of Jesus. And as you do so, his eyes are kindly, quietly burning into yours. You can feel them like lasers probing your heart. And as he looks at you, hear him speaking your name. Notice how softly he repeats it. But as he says your name, you glimpse a slight furrowing of the brow and a hint of pain dulling the kindness in his eyes. Seeing this, you become slightly self-conscious, aware that you are naked of ambition and pretense, nobody but yourself, alone with him. And Jesus is looking more deeply into you now than anyone has ever done before. He speaks your name with that hint of pain. And then comes the question, the challenge more painful than any other. The question is this: do you love me? That's it. Just 4 words. Big deal. And of course you know the right answer right away. With a relieved smile you reply immediately, yes, Lord, you know I do. You've sung it 1,000,000 times in church. And so without a second thought you say yes. We all say yes. Yes, Lord, of course we love you. But the Lord's gaze is unbroken. And he's not mirroring your grin. He seems troubled by your reply. The question is coming again. Do you really love me? A second time, does he doubt me? A little offended, you pause before answering. And as you do so, the question begins to penetrate. The intensity in Jesus' eyes is even greater. The dark, probing lasers of his question going deeper still. And of course, you know why he doubts your first reply. He of all people sees those sins you've allowed to float to the surface. This is the question God has been wanting to ask for a while now. And at last you are coming to him with ears to hear and a vulnerable heart that will not simply dodge the question without a little thought. It's a real question from a friend you sometimes hurt, and a Lord who knows you deny him more often than you let on. Hence the pain when he speaks your name. As you reflect on these things, your quick confessions of love, your easy infidelity, and your embarrassment now, you notice him nodding very slightly, as if reading your mind. And maybe, just maybe, there's the faintest mist of a tear appearing in his eyes. You whisper your reply. Perhaps there's a hint of pain and shame in your features now, because something changes on the face before you. You see tears welling up, unmistakably. But instead of sadness, there is joy. The eyes of your Lord looking at you seem now to have melted into such kind puddles of utter affection that you feel loved as deeply as you realise you are known. Of course, you understand by now that the question must come a third time. But you never expected there to be such surprising vulnerability in the one who asks, "Do you even like me?" Suddenly, with that vulnerable, all-knowing question, an avalanche of emotion surges in through your eyes and pounds into the caverns of your soul. Something, call it love, pain, joy, relief, just wells up inside you, as if a great wave has hit the rocks and now spumes up into the sky through some secret funnel. And this time, your answer to the question comes from the depth of your being, a place deeper than your public pretending, and somehow even deeper than the sins that lie beneath as well. Your answer erupts from the inner sanctum of your soul, the core of your being, like an explosion of champagne, unashamed and unreserved. Yes, Lord, yes, I love you. I love you because you know all things, and you still love me. I am loved. I am known. And what can I do but love you back? Amen.